Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to do an endgame show, and we'll take a look at 3 endgames, and this is the first one. Now, many of you will recognize this. It's, I would say, one of the most famous endgames of all time, but I'm sure for many of you, or at least some of you, this will be brand new. And for those of you who know this, fear not, at least one of our 3 examples, I'm pretty sure, will be new to you. But first, let's start with this one. It's white to move. The pawn count is even. Of course, white has a nice protected passed pawn and a very active rook. On the other hand, white's entire queen side is rather vulnerable. So what should white to play do? Well, the answer, and this is again from one of the most famous endgames of all time, it's Capablanca Tartakover from New York 1924. And Capablanca's solution here is not to play rook takes d7, or rook to d7. So you might think that white should grab a bunch of pawns, black will do the same. And while I think the position here is probably still favors white after all of this business, nevertheless, it's not completely clear that this is that white has serious, or that white is winning. So I think white's still better, but I don't know that it's much better. So black has certainly at least good drawing chances here. So instead of playing like this, Capablanca found a very elegant idea, which I'm sure he saw before he got to this position. So he played king to g3, rook c3 check, king h4, rook f3, g6, rook f4 check, king g5, rook e4, and now king to f6. And this demonstrates, or this is a position that illustrates our theme of the day, which is going to be the concept of the umbrella. Now, an umbrella, of course, is a tool. It's a device that protects its user from something over that person. So, rain, snow, sleet, sunshine. Okay, if it's a really bright day. And in this case, in the chess context, the umbrella is constituted by, whoops. It's constituted by a chess-based menu. No, it's constituted by the pawn on f5. And the point is that if there were no pawn on f5, black could play rook to f4 check, and he wouldn't be losing, or at least it would be very iffy if he was losing. I think it would probably be a draw. But thanks to that pawn on f5, black has no choice but to mount a passive defense. So white threatens rook h8 mate, and black really has to just beat a retreat here. So king to g8. Now a nice move by Capablanca. Rook to g7 check. King h8. And right now, white's down 2 pawns, but they're coming back with interest. So rook c7, threatening rook c8 mate. So black comes back. Now king takes f5. Good move. Just get rid of that pawn so black doesn't get any counterplay out of it. Okay, rook to e4. And now king f6. So another accurate move drives him either back to e8 or to play rook f4 check. Either way, it doesn't matter. King e5, rook to g4. Now another nice move by Capablanca. He plays g7 check. So black can't afford to take it because this pawn ending is an easy win for white. So he has to play king to g8, and now white keeps taking things. Rook a7, king d5. And from 2 pawns down, white's now 2 pawns up. He's taken 4 pawns in a row. And this is going to be an easy win. So the g pawn keeps black tied down, and white will win with the d pawn. So the game concluded pretty straightforwardly. Rook to c1, preventing king c6 and so on, but white's just going to advance the d pawn. Okay, and this is going to enable the white king to get out of the way of the d pawn. And here black resigned. There's just no defense. White's going to, of course, just queen the pawn, and it'll end up being a king and rook versus king situation. So very nice play by Capablanca, and the key thing was, going back to the beginning, to envision this position where the king is able to somehow get from f3 to f6. And once he can do that, once that's achieved, black is going to be completely tied down, and essentially his whole position will be one big vulnerability. So that's exactly what happened, and the key was to of course, first see the idea, and secondly, to be willing to give up quite a bit of material. I mean, he could have even given up a third pawn here with rook takes d4, but after king f6, okay, king g8 would be inadequate. So king e8, and now white can either win with rook to h8 check and g7, or rook takes c7, starting to grab stuff first, and only then going on to promote the pawn to a queen. So sacrificing 2 or even 3 pawns was sufficient because of the bad placement of the black rook and the fact that white has the umbrella pawn on f5, forcing black into complete passivity. Okay, so here we see an example, a classic example of the strong side using the umbrella to achieve a winning position. Okay, let's move on to a second example, another classic example, and this is from the game Lilienthal-Smyslov, so we get to pay further tribute to Smyslov and his greatness in the endgame especially. Here black is worse. Okay, he's down a pawn, and his pawns are all very weak, whereas, okay, the one thing that's in his favor, certainly, is, again, the favorable rook, and his king is more active. So it's not enough to win, as in the Capablanca game, but it is enough to draw, but only with very accurate play. So try to figure out what black to move should do in this position. Okay, well, several ideas might come to mind. You might think, first of all, to defend the pawn with king to f6. The problem with this is that white will simply play something like rook to c7, and with these pawns falling, it's going to be a very difficult job for black to save the game, if it's even possible. Another idea might be to play king e5 right away, and I think this is more on the right track, but after rook takes g7, king e4, I think rook f7 is going to at least make it pretty challenging for black to win this. So the point is that on king f3, which would seem to be the goal, there's no umbrella. Rook takes f5 check, and white will rain down checks upon the black king. So maybe black can hold on by just kind of sitting tight, playing rook a2 or something like that. I'm not sure if it'll succeed. I mean, for one thing, maybe white can play g4 with the idea of takes, rook check, takes. I don't know. This looks like probably a draw to me too. So maybe there's some hopes here, but it's not completely clear. Also, there's a tactical problem that black won't be able to take this pawn anytime soon because of rook to g3. So, okay, black can still fight here. So I don't know if this is lost. Maybe there's some better way for white to handle this, but it's at least a bit of an iffy proposition. I think rook to a5 doesn't work, though. If rook to a5, king e4, rook c5, then g6, and then the pawn will survive, and king f3 is coming. So this, I think, might be a draw for black. So king e5 might hold, although I have my doubts about it, but it's on the right track. So the best move is g5. Okay, well, he keeps the pawn, I should say he keeps the g-pawn, he keeps his pawn structure intact, but still, now it's 2 pawns down. What's his idea? Okay, rook a2, rook h6 check, and now, of course, not king to d7. Going passive in a rook ending when you're on the weak side is almost always the right thing to do. I mean, when we're talking about a king in 1 versus king situation, that's one story. But with many pawns on the board, passive play is usually wrong. So black stays active. King e5, rook c6, king e4, rook c5. And now it might seem as if black's plan has failed because if king f3, there's rook takes f5. But now we see a second point to g5, f4. And, okay, now black is just fine. ef, king f3, and black's king is completely shielded. Now notice, he's 4 pawns down here. Alright, 4 pawns down, but it doesn't matter. Rook to a1, mate, is obviously a huge threat, and white has, he can avoid mate, but he can't avoid perpetual check. So he played h3, rook a1, and they just agreed to a draw. Note, of course, that h4 is not going to avoid the perpetual check, or at least not in a way that white's going to like. Rook a1, king h2, rook a2 check, and if white plays king h3, then g4 is mate. So white had to reconcile himself to the draw with h3, rook a1 check. So very impressive save by Smyslov, and beautifully thematic. So from this position back here, Smyslov realized, okay, I have no winning chances, so I have to find the draw, and he found the most elegant way. Clearly saw the plan of putting the king on f3, found the most efficient way of doing it, and it didn't matter how many pawns were sacrificed, because once the king was on f3, the job was done. Okay, well now let's take a look at a third example, and this is a very recent one. So this was played a week or so ago as of this recording. It was played on April 10th of 2010, and was played in the Russian Team Championship. White was Sergei Rublevsky, very strong grandmaster. I think he's broken 2700. Right now he's 2697, and his opponent is also very strong, Ernesto Inarkiev, 2667. Okay, well we begin in this position after move 57, long tough game, and material is even, but of course white is better. He's got a protected passed e5 pawn. The pawn on g6 is a bit of a target, and the pawn on d5 is a bit of a target, but this beautiful knight on e7 keeps everything held together, as does the king on e6. So the king on e6 blockades the e-file, protects the d-pawn, and can maybe shift over to f7 if need be, if white were to try to pile up on the g6 pawn. And black's rooks on the b-file also are useful because they prevent white's knight from running off anywhere either. So the knight can't really jump into d6 because if rook takes b3. So while white is the only player with winning chances here, assuming of course white doesn't self-destruct, it's still pretty difficult to see how positively to win this game. So you might want to take a little time here and try to think of some plans for white. Okay, well, one clear idea is going to involve b4. I mean, that seems like the most obvious thing to do. And it's a question of timing and what's the best way of executing it. So here's what Rublevsky came up with. So he thought, okay, what I want to do with my king is not really try to penetrate on the queen side. That doesn't seem likely to work. But where maybe I can penetrate someday is via the d4 square. Really, the d4 square is very important for white. So what he does is, first of all, bring his king to the center for a couple of reasons. One is that, again, he may want to penetrate via d4 with the king. A second reason is that if he's going to open up play on the queen side, he doesn't want his king to be over there where black's pieces might be able to drum up some counterplay. So after a few temporizing moves, he finally jumps into action. Actually, I should mention that black's king c6 was an inaccuracy, allowing e6. So that was actually a little mistake, but both players missed it. And anyway, we're back here with the thematic moment. So first of all, white now plays b4. So he's happy to have black take twice, because then he'll just run him through on the c file. Also, maybe knight to c7 might show up too in some cases. So black keeps that file closed with c4. But nevertheless, okay, the d4 square is a brand new asset in white's at white's disposal. Okay, so he takes on a5, knight to d4, which is a great square for the knight, in part because there's a barrier against black's king. So the knight covers c6 and e6, the pawn covers d6, and so now after rook a4, rook to b1, rook a2, takes, rook b7, you can see that black's king is driven back to the edge of the board. And now black has to be kind of careful. I mean, it's not so easy for him to handle this position. He's up a pawn, yes, but his king is not really in great shape. And the funny thing is, okay, he needs his knight there, or he needs something besides the king to fight against white's passed e-pawn as this drives up the board. However, by having the knight on e7, sometimes his king ends up getting stuck. So imagine, for instance, that white has the pawn on e6 and black's king is on e8. Well, in that case, rook to b8 check wins a piece. So it's like it's almost mate. I mean, it's a sort of back rank mate, except black can play knight c8 and lose the knight. And maybe even there he might not even get off so easy. Maybe white can play knight to c6, assuming that the black rook isn't covering that. So that would be mating next move. Or, well, okay, maybe king f8. Anyway, you can see that black's king is in a lot of trouble and he's losing a piece there. So this is a position where black has to be really careful. White indeed plays e6, and black plays rook a6. So he realizes that there's potential trouble. He can't give white freedom to create more threats. And by playing rook to a6, he keeps an eye on the e-pawn, which not only does he keep an eye on the e-pawn, he also keeps white's knight off of any possible 6th rank location. And furthermore, remember, white wants to bring his king in via d4. Well, to do that, he'd have to move the knight first, but if he moves the knight, he drops the pawn. So, good defense. Okay, well, white plays king to e3. And here, again, black plays a very good move. So see if you can figure out what black to move should do. Well, let's look at what he shouldn't do. So you might think he should just sit and wait with rook to d6. It's quite logical, but there's tactical problems. Rook to b8 check, king c7. If knight to c8, then e7 check is winning a piece. So king c7, and now rook e8 with 2 threats. So threatening to take the knight, and threatening knight to b5 check. So that just decides. If knight to c8, which looks pretty plausible, now white's rook benefits by jumping to the other side of the board. Rook d7 and rook to h7, and ultimately black's king side is going to fall apart here. So black can go for some counterplay with moves like rook a3 or knight e4, but white's e-pawn is still very strong, and black is really stuck. I mean, he's got to keep an eye on that, but you know, if he just sits passively, he loses his entire king side. The g pawn will fall, the h pawn will fall, probably the f5 pawn will fall as well. So this is losing for black as well. So black found, I think, the only move to stay alive. Rook to a1. So now one point is that if a move like knight to b5, then white has black has rook e1 check and rook takes e6. So here Wróblewski played knight to f3. So a very good move. Stops rook to e1 check, and again prepares king d4, king e5, and king f6, or king to d6, depending on what's available. But probably king f6. Okay, well, again, black has to be very careful. Rook a6 looks obvious, but after knight to g5, king to d4 is coming. Knight to c6 is not that good. Again, because the whole king side will fall. So black found the only move here too, knight to c6. Keeping the king out. Rook to d7 check, king e8. And now rook takes d5 is not really so great, because rook to a3, the only way to protect the c-pawn is with king to d2, and now rook a2 check. And black can just go back and forth, and his rook is just very active in general, and white's king is pretty safe for the moment, or black's king is pretty safe for the moment. There's no real serious threats to promote or attack it. So white played rook to d6, and now finally black went awry. So it's a very precarious position. He's been holding on by a thread, and we're on move 79 here, so he's had to defend this game for a long, long time. But finally he breaks. The right move is rook to a6, and I can't find a win after this. I wouldn't say that I tried for hours and hours, but I tried for a while and didn't find a win. So I'll give 3 examples. If knight to d4, okay, this is the simplest, just knight to b4, takes, knight c6, and it's one move too late. If white's king were already on d4, that would be one thing, but knight c7. And black is better. I mean, maybe white can draw this, but okay, white's going to be doing the suffering here. So knight to d4 is not so good. If rook takes d5, now, not knight to d8. So you might think this just to get rid of that very annoying e-pawn. But after knight to g5, knight e6, rook e5, white's winning. So it's, even though it's a king and pawn ending where black is a pawn up, the key thing is that white will take the c-pawn. I mean, this is just going to be easy. Takes, king d4. And see, the thing is, okay, if black does nothing, he takes, pushes the c-pawn, and then comes in and gobbles up the king side. And something like g5 just doesn't help because white's king is in time. It's in the square. So let's say king to d6, king c4, f4, And I mean, even if it were black to move, white would be fine. So this is just completely lost for black. So after rook takes d5, not knight to d8, but rook to a3. So hitting the pawn, rook c5, rook c3 check, king e2, knight e7, knight g5, rook c2, and this seems to be equal. So, you know, white's maybe doing the pushing a little bit, but basically he doesn't quite have enough coordination. And notice that white is also playing without his king. So both players are in effect playing without a king from the standpoint of using it as an offensive piece. Okay, so rook takes d5. There's some pressure on black, but I think he can hold. Finally, knight to e5 is a third try. d4 check is the right move here, taking d4 from white's king. So cd, rook a3 check. And this is the other point. And I think that black is holding here. So king e2, knight e5, fe5, f4, rook d7, and rook to d3. And black's split pawns are as dangerous as white's connected pawns. So this is a draw as well. Okay, so it looks like with perfect play, black could have held this, but it's not easy. And in the game he played knight to d8. And now white plays in a way reminiscent of the games we've seen already. So he's got a lot of weak pawns, but he realizes the most important thing here is activating his king. So he plays king to d4. Rook f1, knight to g5. So who needs the f pawn? Who needs the h pawn? Whatever, doesn't matter. So for instance, if rook takes f4, king e5, let's say rook f1, king f6, and well, the threat is to play knight f7. And it turns out that this surprisingly simple threat is very difficult to meet. So for instance, rook to e1, knight f7, and now if black plays knight to b7, okay, just rook to a6, no big deal. Threatening rook to a8, knight goes back, and now not rook a8 because of rook takes e6 check, but just take, and rook a8, and e7, and white's winning. So black's got a lot of pawns, but they're nowhere near fast enough. White wins. Okay, another idea, instead of knight to b7, is to try to sack our way out of this. So takes, takes, and takes. And black has 3 pawns for the piece, but they're not going to live. f4, knight e5, and white is going to gobble up all the pawns just in time and win. So for instance, if d4, let me think here. I think we just play cd, c3, d5, c2, d6, queen, check here, queen. Actually, this one I'm not completely sure about. If I remember right, I think I looked at this at one point. Yeah, king b7 is forced. Knight to d6 looks pretty plausible because the king can't ever go to the c file because of queen c8. So king a7, maybe no, this just gets mated like this. So king a6 would seem to be forced. Okay, now this is mating. Okay, or winning the queen. So the king goes to the c file, queen c8. We have a skewer, and otherwise we drive him to a mating square. Okay. So it's close, but it's a win. So in the game, black didn't play rook takes f4, but played rook to d1 check, king e5, and now d4. So still hoping for counterplay, but it's too slow. King f6. And black played knight to b7. And here you might want to try to figure out how white to move should handle this. What do we do? In fact, there's a lot of ways to win this, but white found an especially stylish way to end the game. All right, well, he starts off with the move knight f7. Okay, so it's very easy to calculate that knight takes d6 is just bad. White takes back with the knight, plays e7, plays e8, queen, game over. Okay, but black plays rook to d2. So now he's hoping to be able to play d takes c3, which not only gives him a strong or potentially strong passed pawn, but it also helps with the defense. So what should white to move do here? Okay, so we put the knight on f7. Is there anything it can do from there? Well, the answer is yes, and it's very pretty. So rook to d8 check, and black resigned. Knight takes d8, check, 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 and mate. So that would have been the finale had black decided to keep going all the way. So, very nice endgame by Wroblewski. And really, this game could be used to illustrate a number of endgame themes. So, do not hurry. I mean, that's always crucial when you have a position where your opponent has basically nothing that he can do, which is what we had at the start of this. Then it's always good to kind of tack around, gain some time on the clock, look for possible plans, and only when you're really good and ready to commit to do so. So that's one idea. Okay, there's also, the idea of the principle of two weaknesses. So black had, or let's say multiple weaknesses. So black had certain problems. He was always kind of tied down by the pawn on e5, but by itself that wasn't enough. So Wroblewski had to find other ways of stretching black's defensive resources as thin as possible. And then, of course, the final idea, besides this breakthrough, well, we also had this preparation idea with the king, getting it out of the way, clearing the queenside files for his own rook to be active. And then finally, we had this very nice breakthrough idea, which utilized, once again, this umbrella concept. So from here, we finally saw white was able to make the crucial break with his king. So into d4, and to e5, and to f6, where, of course, not just black's pawn, but white's pawn as well. This whole f-file was completely clogged up, and that made his king just an awesome attacking unit. It couldn't be bothered by the knight, no pawns can bother it, and the rook can't bother it either. So despite black's material advantage and his own desperate attempts for counterplay, it's just too late. White's playing with an extra king and was able to use it for a mating attack. I mean, really, if you think about this as an attack, white has 4 attacking pieces. Of course, the king can't check black's king, but it can take away lots of squares, and I mean that's essentially what you have at the end with this very nice mating combination. So, a beautiful endgame by Wroblewski. I think definitely one that's worth studying and appreciating, and I hope also that it illustrated our main theme, which was this umbrella notion. So thanks a lot. Hope everybody learned something out of this. And you ate your veggies, so you had your endgame study. Okay, some people don't enjoy studying endgames, but when you look at practical endgames, I think it becomes a lot more interesting and easier to learn that way. So thanks again, and I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.